Today we're going to be talking all about the new Pantone markers by Talens. Full disclosure, I am an art ambassador for Talens, and these markers were given to me to test out and collect my first impressions. So that's exactly what I'm going to give you guys today as well. On the side of the box, you'll see a printed representation of the Pantone color markers that are inside. These are not actual Pantone regulated color chips, and inside the box there are no chips. Just so that you know, when you receive this, you're just getting the markers with the Pantone Matching System, charmfully called the PMS system. Alright, so let's open this box up here. As you can see, it's very high quality, and it's actually designed to sit horizontally on your desk just like this, so that all of the ink is optimized in the center of the marker and is evenly distributed to both of the nibs. And there's kind of like a little nub on the bottom of the cap that keeps everything upright. Normally, Talens is very transparent about what is inside of their products. However, because this is a collaboration, Pantone has decided to keep that information proprietary. So, unfortunately, I don't have all of the information to share with you guys, but I will share everything I know. So there's 4 different pads of paper at this point, 2 sketchbooks and 2 art pads in the size A4 and A5. This paper, again, is a proprietary formula, but what we do know is that it's acid-free, it's a very bright white, and to me it kind of feels like a plate Bristol. There are specific instructions for how to get the perfect Pantone color with the combination of these markers and this paper. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and look at the markers. As you can see, it has a Pantone number on the marker, which corresponds with the colored chip. It is a double-ended marker, and one side is kind of a flexible brush nib, while the other side is kind of a more firm chisel tip. On the cap of the marker, as well as on the body of the marker itself, there is a Pantone number, and the cap kind of emulates the color of the Pantone, but it's not an exact match. So let's go ahead and give these a try. In order to get the perfect Pantone color, you need to do one layer with the chisel nib. But because we're artists and I want to see how these colors stack, almost more like a mass tone, for the top part, I'm going to fill it in a little bit more, and then right below, I'm just going to do one solid stripe. I don't really plan to use these markers for their Pantone quality because that's just not really what kind of artist I am. However, if you are a designer of some sort, then you probably are familiar with the PMS Pantone Color Matching System, and essentially all that it is a standardized color system, and it's basically to help printers and designers specify and control certain colors for printing projects. The ink inside the markers is also proprietary information, but I do want to share what I do know. The colors are pigment-based and light-fast, so they're going to remain this bright and vibrant over time. Because the markers and inks are water-based, they are fast-drying, waterproof, and have no toxic odor. If you are familiar with using alcohol markers or acrylic markers, this feels very different than the both of them. Typically with alcohol markers, the ink kind of levels itself a little bit and some of the streaking disappears. That was not my experience with these markers. As far as it being an acrylic marker, those are typically pretty opaque, and these are very transparent. Overall, I'm very happy with the color selection of this set in particular. It's very nice of them to give us 3 of each color family, plus a whole bunch of browns and neutral grays to work with. And for those of you that are curious, this is the 27 General Selection set. They do have a bunch of different sets to choose from, or open stock, and there's 108 colors in total. Talens is having me do some of the educational pamphlets that we hand out, and a lot of those is basically just sharing techniques. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of test out the markers and tell you my thoughts on them as we go along. First, let's try out the brush nib. This is my favorite of the 2 nibs on the marker. You can be a lot more expressive with the tip. The harder you press down, the deeper the color you're going to get. Also, there's a very wide range between very skinny and a little bit wider. The chisel nib is a lot more firm, and you're going to be able to get a lot better geometric shapes out of it because it's less flexible. There's a couple different angles that you can use on this chisel nib to get different strokes. And there is a pretty good range between strokes, and your fill is going to be more consistent. For the continuous fill, all you basically need to do is just not pick up your marker in between strokes. This should leave you with a pretty distributed, even fill of an area. Depending on what color you use, I've gotten different results for this. Normally, the lighter colors are a little bit more forgiving. To do an intermittent fill, which is just another way to kind of block in a large area, if you pick up your marker at the end of each stroke and slightly overlap, then you'll get a little bit of a line in between your colors. So if you're going for stripes, this is a good way to get them. A great way to get contrast out of this is going to be to stack up your colors. If you use the same color and just go over an area twice, either with the intermittent or continuous technique, then you'll build up contrast. You can also do this with multiple colors. It's basically just a very simple layering technique. If you would like your markers to gradually go from one value to a deeper shade, this is a simple way to do so. Use your marker to fill in the area and then continue to add layers to deepen the value as you go. The more layers you add, the darker it will be. With some of the markers in this selection, because they are so saturated, it can be difficult to build up that deep tone. So if you're having issues, you can always use multiple markers from the same color family to get more dramatic results. If you're not filling, then there's other ways that you can use these markers. Scumbling and stippling are two very expressive ways. I prefer the brush nib for both of these. If you're planning on doing any sort of foliage, grass, or perhaps animal hair, something like that, then the hatching technique is pretty simple. I again like to use brush nib for this just to get some more expressive strokes. If you have watched any of the other videos on my channel, you'll know that I am an absolute fiend for mixed media, so I had to try these markers out. They did smear the graphite sketch, so keep that in mind. Do a very light sketch. The acrylic ink layered beautifully on top of the Pantone ink, which is wonderful if you need to put some white highlights back into your sketch. For the most part, I would say that the colored pencils did not work at all. So if you plan on using these markers on a different paper, perhaps that would be a different outcome. I also wanted to try the Micron out with the markers, and it sat on top of the ink beautifully. Really smooth paper makes for a nice Micron line. I would definitely do it on top of the markers as opposed to below. So for this variety of fill techniques and pretty direct strokes with the nibs, I think that they worked well. I personally am most excited to use them with the white acrylic ink and building up layers. I do like a lot of layers in my art. However, these markers lend themselves to a very graphic style because they do not blend. And perhaps these markers don't need to blend because the people that are using them for the Pantone quality don't necessarily need that. They just need a fill of a flat color. However, if you want those two flat colors to meet in the middle, blending would be a very nice technique to be able to have in your arsenal. So typically for blending, you do two colors. This would be like the most basic method, and then you use the lighter of those two colors to blend the darker into the lighter. And as you can see here, I'm ferociously scrubbing the paper and ink together to try to make those two colors blend. I eventually did make them blend by really layering up that ink and just repeating this method. I can't see myself going through all of this struggle in my art to make a blend happen, but props to the paper for holding up to a ton of layering and scrubbing. It's very durable, and blending can be done if you really work at it. However, In my opinion, that's not a very successful blend, and it took a ton of effort and ink. I think that they do not blend because the ink dries too quickly. So if you want to try to blend it, just make sure you have a puddle of ink and that it is very wet. So if you're not going to blend, then you definitely need to layer in order to color mix and provide smooth transitions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the layering qualities of these markers. Here I'm using the three lightest primary colors in this set, and here I'm using the three darkest primaries in this set. As I fill, you'll be able to see that the more pastel, less saturated colors, in my opinion, actually color mix a little bit better than these darker selection of colors. Optically, you're going to get more of a range out of the lighter colors, so just something to keep in mind. So now that we have our techniques down and we've played around with the markers a little bit, let's put them to the test in an illustration. Going to use the three reds in this pack plus the three greens. It's nice that there's a light, medium, and dark so that I can just simply plug in my values from light to dark. Now you'll see there's a little bit of wetness on the paper as I go that's kind of creating a reflective quality. This ink does settle down a little bit, but while it's still wet, you can smudge it. So if you're going to pile up the ink as I am right here, just keep in mind because I did end up smudging mine a little bit. I used the brush tips for this entire illustration, and the colors layered up beautifully on each other. I think that these colors are very bold and beautiful, and the darks in this set are very dark. So that's really nice to be able to have that contrast. Once I was done layering up all my color, I did go around with a micron just to give it a nice clean outline. And you know me, had to use the white acrylic ink to throw some highlights on there. And that white acrylic ink was really delightful to use on top because these markers dry waterproof. So you can layer up that ink with a little bit of water to blend it out, and the ink isn't going to move underneath. So that was a pretty smooth looking illustration. I wanted to go the opposite direction and try something that was a little bit choppier and more expressive. Again, both of these illustrations, I'm really harnessing the power of layering as opposed to actually doing a blend, a smooth transition in between colors. So for the owl, I just did very small, choppy lines for the entire drawing. I started with my grays and then moved into my browns. And again, it's just very important that you work light to dark because you cannot get the lights back. And while I was doing both of these illustrations, I was just kind of thinking about Pantone and if they would potentially offer down the line an opaque white Pantone marker. That would be, I think, a wonderful addition to this collection because it would allow users to have the opportunity to build up their layers since this is such a layering oriented marker. If they want their users to be able to blend the markers together, perhaps they come up with a colorless blender that has just a clear binder or whatever formula they're using in their markers to help the two different tones blend together. That way, their users of the markers won't have to worry so much about not being able to blend and also having to be very careful when they layer. So for my pros and cons list, under pro, we have pigmented, light fast, bold colors, two different nibs. They have an awesome storage system. They are refillable, nibs and ink, and also the Pantone system. Under cons, I have that they are streaky and not blendable. So if it is important to you that your markers are streak-free or that they blend, these may not be the markers for you. However, if you're going for that Pantone quality that they have, then there's a ton of amazing pros that you can definitely utilize with these markers. I hope that this first impressions video gave you some insight into these, and thanks so much for watching my video. Have a wonderful week.